Standing in your own garden, have you ever harbored such a question? The garden is by no means small. There are furrows. Vegetables are also being grown. When spring comes, seedlings are planted, and when summer arrives, there is a decent harvest. Yet why do you find yourself going to the supermarket almost every week to buy more vegetables? Have you ever thought that things would be different if you just had a little more land? Have you ever thought that if the garden were bigger, it could better support the family's dining table? But what if the real problem isn't the size? What if what is lacking is not the land itself, but how that land is used? I too thought that way for a long time. Like many people, I followed the spacing written on the seed packets, aligned the rows, left wide pathways, and planted everything together at once. It looked beautiful. As a garden, it looked tidy, and it was easy to tend. However, as the season progressed, I was always made to realize the same thing. A lot of the soil in the garden was not actually producing food. There were long blank spaces between the rows, and there were places where nothing grew while waiting for the seedlings to get larger. Those places were not growing crops, they were merely growing weeds. Around that time, I had the opportunity to visit an Amish family. The garden behind their house was not particularly larger than mine. In fact, depending on how you looked at it, it felt even smaller. There was no eye-catching modern equipment there, nor were there any flashy contrivances. What was, there were orderly furrows and arrangement without waste, simple stakes made of wood, narrow pathways, and vigorously growing vegetables. However, what strongly moved my heart was not its appearance, it was the reality that the garden was supporting. That garden was supporting the dining table of a family of 12. Moreover, that was not just for a short period during the summer. It does not refer only to the abundant harvest season of July or August. In autumn, in winter, and even into early spring, the food grown in that garden lined the dining table. During the warm seasons, they ate it fresh, and the surplus was canned, fermented, dried, and put away in the pantry. Therefore, the summer harvest does not end only during the summer. The harvested food continues to support the family's life across the months and days. It was then that I first began to think seriously about the power of a garden. Why is it that despite being similar, home vegetable gardens, one garden is only useful for a few months, while another can provide support for most of the year? As I searched for the answer, I came to understand that there is no complex secret. In many typical home vegetable gardens, the area actually used to grow crops is less than one might think. Wide pathways, empty time, unused soil. Such things accumulate and lower the productive power of the entire garden. It is not that the area of the field is insufficient, it is that there are too many unused places. The Amish people view the garden from a completely different perspective. To them, the garden is not a place to enjoy a few vegetables in the summer. The garden is a system that continues to produce food and an important foundation supporting their lives. Every single furrow has a role. When one crop finishes, another crop takes over that spot. If there is even a slightly empty period, they insert fast-growing vegetables to eliminate waste. Crops that can stretch upwards are grown three-dimensionally using stakes and trellises. When the harvest is large, they even consider how to preserve that surplus. Seeing that, I learned something major. A highly productive garden cannot be created simply by planting a lot, nurturing the soil, reading the seasons, layering the use of space, and planning beyond the harvest. Only when all of these connect does it truly become a garden with power. There is no special magic in an Amish garden. What is there is merely an approach devoid of waste, refined over generations, and practices rooted in daily life. That day, I finally realized, the potential of a garden is not determined by its size alone. What creates the real difference is whether you can find value in every single place. Even a small amount of soil, even a short amount of time, if not overlooked, they turn into food. If that way of thinking changes the appearance of the garden, changes too. What I'm going to talk about from here is neither an exaggerated miracle nor a special trick. However, just by knowing it, the way your current garden looks will surely change significantly. After realizing that the garden's problem is not its size itself, the eyes with which I looked at my own field changed greatly. Until then, I thought a garden that looked tidy was a good garden. The rows were straight, the spacing was uniform, the pathways were wide, and I was satisfied that the whole thing looked beautiful. Certainly, it looks easier to manage that way, and visually, it brings a sense of security. However, the closer I looked, the more I understood that a massive waste was hidden within that orderliness. Much of the space I thought was beautiful was not actually producing food. Here lies the first major difference between a typical home vegetable garden and an Amish garden. Many people plant while thinking about how to make the garden look tidy. However, the Amish people plant while thinking about how to get more food from a limited piece of land. Rather than prioritizing tidying the appearance, they prioritize giving a role to every single place in the field. That difference in mindset drastically changes the very way of planting. Many of us believe the spacing written on seed packets exactly as it is and plant accordingly. Of course, that is not wrong. However, in many cases, those numbers assume large fields or row planting that allows tools to pass through easily. In cultivation methods that require leeway for machinery or wheelbarrows to pass, it makes a certain amount of sense. However, in a small garden behind a house, that wide spacing can directly lead to low productivity. This is because space is being taken up for blank areas, not for the crops. The Amish people do not create their gardens with such a mindset. They do not determine the spacing of plants based on the convenience of machinery. They determine the arrangement by looking at the space the plant itself needs when it grows, how the leaves will spread, how the sunlight will hit, how much moisture the soil can retain. They consider all of these things together. As a result, the distance between plants is often closer than in a typical garden. However, they are not forcefully cramming them in. They are merely using the necessary space without waste. When I first saw an Amish tomato furrow, I was surprised by its orderliness. Instead of letting the tomatoes crawl widely across the ground, as I used to do, they were firmly tied to stakes and grown upwards, ever upwards. Each individual plant was lined up at an appropriate interval, and overall it looked quite dense. Even so, there was no impression of being cramped. Rather, it looked as if each plant was firmly given its own place, growing efficiently while receiving both light and wind. By reducing the waste that spreads across the ground, a much larger harvest can be expected, even from a furrow of the same size. Research on dense planting cultivation suggests that when managed correctly, the harvest yield can double or quadruple in the same area. However, what is important here is that you cannot just cram anything in. If the soil is poor, the plants will compete for nutrients and weaken. If moisture is lacking, the burden increases proportionally to the overlapping leaves. In other words, to succeed in dense planting, the soil must first be made rich. The reason Amish gardens can maintain high productivity is that they never postpone this soil building. Every year, they carefully return compost and organic matter to the soil. Fallen leaves, plant remnants, and organic matter from the kitchen are not simply thrown away, but treated as resources to support the next harvest. Only when the soil is soft, holds water, and can firmly store nutrients can plants grow healthily, even at close distances. The wisdom passed down for a long time lies in the fact that this order is never reversed. What I learned from this was not merely a trick for how to plant. What was truly important was not overlooking the value of a limited space. Just because it is a large garden does not guarantee a rich harvest. Even if it is small, if every place there is used correctly, it can produce a surprisingly large amount of food. Growing tomatoes upwards, planting lettuce spreading across the entire furrow instead of in narrow rows. Growing carrots with high density without dividing them with wide pathways. The accumulation of each of these contrivances pushes up the power of the entire garden. Looking from the outside, the difference might be just a few centimeters of spacing. However, those few centimeters drastically change the amount of the harvest. The Amish people are not performing special miracles. They are simply thoroughly applying the concept of making every place in the field work. That very stance is the foundation for drawing out more food than imagined from a small garden. As the arrangement of plants begins to change, the expression of the garden also shifts little by little. However, that alone is not yet enough. No matter how skillfully you implement dense planting, if you maintain the mindset of planting once and being done, you cannot truly draw out the power of the garden. When spring arrives, many people try to plant as much as possible in a single task. They use their weekends to set seedlings and sow seeds, then simply wait for growth while watering. When the harvest season comes, they gather a lot at once and are satisfied with that. This seems like a very natural approach, but in reality it misses a significant portion of the value of time that the garden possesses. The Amish people do not use their gardens in that way. To them, a garden is not a simple flow that begins in spring and ends in autumn. Every time one crop finishes, the next is already waiting. When a harvest ends in a certain furrow, that spot is not left abandoned to rest, but immediately enters preparation to welcome new life. In this way, the entire garden continues to work without interruption. This mindset is one of the major reasons why their gardens are so productive. At the heart of this is the method of succession planting, sowing multiple times by staggering the schedule. Instead of planting the same vegetable only once, they sow a little at a time every 2 or 3 weeks. Lettuce is an easy example to understand. If you sow it only once in spring, the harvest will concentrate all at once after a while, and once the heat arrives, it easily spoils. Once it bolts, it is no longer delicious to eat. However, if you sow a new row every few weeks, by the time the first batch of lettuce is finished, the next batch is just reaching maturity. Thus, the harvest period is lengthened, and it becomes rare for lettuce to disappear from the dining table. Fast-growing vegetables like radishes demonstrate particular power with this method. Since the fastest varieties can be harvested in less than a month, they can fulfill the role of filling the gaps between long-growing crops. In typical home vegetable gardens, such vegetables are often grown only a little in early spring and then finished. However, in an Amish garden, it is precisely these fast-growing vegetables that become vital existences for filling the gaps in time. To ensure a single furrow continues to grow something over a long period, short-lived crops are skillfully integrated. This way of thinking is often discussed in research on intensive home gardening as well. Depending on the climate and soil conditions, it is considered entirely possible to obtain 3 to 5 harvests a year from a single furrow. What is important is not merely overworking the same furrow. It is planning what to put in at what time and returning necessary nutrients to the soil while ensuring the flow of crops does not stop. By doing so, the land is not just used longer. It transforms into a place that generates higher value. The Amish people do not rely on intuition alone to do this. They have a firm grasp of planting timings, around when the last frost of spring ends, when the first cold of autumn arrives, how many days each vegetable takes until harvest. Based on such factors, they decide what to sow and when. In other words, the garden is not running well by chance. It is designed down to the very use of time. To me, this concept was very fresh. Until then, I had thought of garden work as a major one-time task in spring. I thought that if I worked hard to plant at the beginning, I only had to watch over it afterward. However, a highly productive garden was not like that. There is always a next move. There is something being harvested right now, and simultaneously the next seeds are entering the soil. If a crop ends, another crop immediately takes over its place. Because that flow exists even in a garden of the same size, the amount of food obtained throughout the entire season changes significantly. The charm of this method is that the garden feels as if it is always alive. No long blanks remain after a harvest ends. Instead of the garden falling into a deep silence every time a season finishes, new crops begin to fulfill their next roles. The power of the land does not end with a one-time harvest. By making time an ally, a small garden becomes a place that produces food over and over. Thinking this way, one comes to realize that the value of a garden is determined not only by its area, but also by how many times that location can work within a single year. As it becomes clear that multiple harvests can be obtained from a single furrow within a season, many people feel that the possibilities of the garden have expanded greatly just by that. Indeed, it is a very significant change. However, there is still one more important perspective in an Amish garden. That is not to view the garden only two-dimensionally. Most of us think of the garden's size in terms of length and width. We try to measure the power of the garden by how much ground there is. But the Amish people believe that the space spreading above the ground is also a place of production. In other words, a garden does not consist of the ground alone. It can be used including the layers of air above it. This way of thinking leads directly to the contrivance of vertical gardening. If there are vining plants or crops that can be guided upwards with stakes, they guide them upwards as much as possible. Instead of letting them crawl and spread across the ground, they use stakes or trellises to direct them toward the sky. By doing so, they can assign more roles within the same area. To increase harvest yield within limited land, spreading horizontally is not enough. The mindset is that if there is space that can be used vertically as well, that should not be wasted either. I myself used to grow cucumbers by letting them crawl on the ground. Certainly they grow that way. However, after a while, the vines spread more. Then imagined the leaves cover the ground, and the fruit becomes hidden near the soil. If rain continues, they easily get muddy, and moisture tends to trap. Every time I harvested, I had to part the leaves, search for the fruit, and be careful not to step on them. However, in an Amish garden, cucumbers were growing upwards, along simple trellises or strings. Then the fruit hangs down, making it easy to find, hard to get dirty, and easy to harvest. Moreover, because they do not occupy a large area of the ground, the space beneath can be utilized in another form. The same applies to pole beans. Typical bush beans are easy to handle and can be harvested all at once, but production is completed only on the limited ground. In contrast, beans that are grown upwards using stakes or simple structures can often be harvested longer, even from the same footprint area. Research in vertical gardening also shows that for cucumbers and vining crops using trellises improves airflow and sunlight, and, as a result, increases production efficiency. The Amish people might not speak of such logic in difficult terms, but from years of experience, they know that it is more advantageous for the field as a whole. Tomatoes are also a crop where the vertical concept is clearly expressed. When grown as if spreading on the ground, a single plant requires a very wide space. The branches and leaves entwine complexly, the fruit becomes hard to see, and the lower leaves are prone to moisture. However, when grown by setting stakes and pruning necessary branches, tomatoes take on a much cleaner form. They are gathered like a single pillar, and plants can be arranged more efficiently even within the same furrow. Management and observation become easier, and light and air enter more readily. The difference is not just about appearance, it leads to ease of work and stability of harvest. What is important is that these contrivances do not necessarily require expensive equipment. What is used in an Amish garden is often not a grand commercial system, but very rustic things like wooden stakes, twine, and sticks of convenient length. However, there is great value within that simplicity. What matters is not the luxury of the materials, but the very idea of trying to use the space above. Even a fence at the edge of the garden, if you change your perspective, becomes a splendid cultivation surface. With just a little contrivance space that was originally empty, transforms into a place that produces food. Even more interesting is that by guiding plants upwards, the ground beneath becomes available again. Underneath the trellises where vines have been raised, you can combine leafy greens that grow better when the sunlight is slightly softened, or crops that can be harvested in a short time. In other words, a single location begins to work like two layers instead of one. For a person who has learned the contrivance of not wasting time, it can be said that progressing to the contrivance of not wasting height is a very natural flow. In this way, the garden ceases to be a mere flat field. It becomes a three-dimensional place where the ground works, time works, and even the space above works. Behind the fact that a small garden can produce a harvest beyond imagination lies this invisible shift in perspective. Instead of increasing the land, deepening the use of the current space, the accumulation of such efforts expands the possibilities of the garden significantly. As the use of the ground becomes more skillful and the space above also becomes a place of production, the garden enters an even deeper stage. From here on, it is not just about planting densely or replanting multiple times throughout the season. The contrivance of which plants to place, near which other plants, significantly changes the power of the entire garden. Observing an Amish garden, this becomes very clear. They do not see each crop as a separate entity, but as a mutually supportive relationship within the same furrow. Which plant grows quickly, which spreads slowly, which reaches high, and which grows calmly in a low place. By considering these combinations, they assign multiple roles to the same location. In many home vegetable gardens, people often plant only one type of vegetable in a single furrow. Tomatoes, only in the tomato furrow. Peppers, only in the pepper furrow. Cabbage, only in the cabbage furrow. That method is easy to understand and easy to manage. However, that alone cannot be said to fully draw out the potential that a garden possesses. The Amish people add another level of nuanced perspective. Fast growers and slow growers. Tall plants and low plants. Those that need a lot of light initially, and those that can be grown even if a little shade is created. By observing these differences, they use a single furrow in multiple layers of time and height. This concept is the power of what is called intercropping, or mixed planting. I felt this meaning clearly when I saw a newly planted tomato furrow. When the seedlings have just been planted, the tomatoes are still small. Even if they will spread out widely in the future, at that point, there is a considerable amount of blank space between the plants. Normally, that empty space is left as a place to wait until the tomatoes get larger. However, in an Amish garden, they do not waste even that waiting time. On the very day the tomato seedlings are planted, they might sow fast-growing radishes around them. Since radishes can be harvested in a short period, by the time the tomatoes truly need the space, the radishes are already on the dining table. In other words, two flows overlap effortlessly in the same place. This concept is also clearly understood in the combination of peppers and lettuce. Newly planted peppers are low in height, and their leaves have not spread very much. If you put lettuce in the space between them, the lettuce grows in the soft light of early spring and is harvested before it gets hot. Then, as summer approaches and the pepper leaves grow large and begin to use the space, the lettuce's role is finished. Although it is the same area by staggering the time the two crops grow without competing, such contrivances are a very major force in making rich use of a limited garden. Even more interesting is the idea of combining tall and low crops and slow and fast-growing crops. For example, cabbage and carrots might seem difficult to put in the same furrow at first glance, but looking closely, the spaces they use are different. Cabbage spreads its leaves upwards and eventually covers the ground surface. Meanwhile, carrots grow relatively low and their main growth progresses underground. By devising the arrangement, these two can handle different layers within the same furrow. Moreover, the soft shade created by cabbage leaves during hot periods can become a comfortable environment for carrots. Not competition, but coexistence is born by slightly shifting the space and timing of use. The basics of this intercropping are very easy to understand. Combine a crop that finishes early with a crop that grows slowly. Combine a crop that grows tall with a crop that stays low. Place crops next to each other that do not strongly require the same space at the same moment. Once this is understood, the way you see the furrows changes, because they appear not as places where things are simply lined up in a single row, but as places where multiple movements flow simultaneously. I was particularly drawn to the contrivance of sowing radishes in a circle around the seedlings, sowing radish seeds as if drawing a small circle around the base of tomato pepper or young squash seedlings. This is not merely to increase a small harvest. Since they sprout quickly, The soil around the seedling immediately becomes a living space. The dryness of the surface is softened, and by the time they are eventually pulled out, the soil feels slightly loosened. It is a very slight contrivance, but the typical Amish gardening mindset is well expressed within that slightness. It is the stance of not leaving empty space or empty time as they are. Looking at it this way, the garden feels less like a collection of mere furrows and more like a small ecosystem. One crop creates a short shade for another. One crop, being harvested first, yields space to a crop that will grow large later. One crop gently protects the ground surface, while another crop extends its roots deep in the meantime. Within such layering, the entire garden begins to work more richly. Reaching this point, it becomes clear that gardening is not merely about planting more, but about combining more wisely. And as that perspective develops, even in a garden of the same size, the blessings obtained from it increase quietly but surely. As the contrivances of dense planting begin to come alive in the garden, staggered. Planting creates a flow, the idea of using height is added, and the combination of crops draws out the power of the furrows. One important reality eventually comes into view. A well-tended garden is not merely a place that lets you eat fresh vegetables for a few weeks in the summer. A well-managed garden produces much more. And to make that abundance truly valuable, one must think, including what to do after the harvest. Here, for the first time, the mechanism of the Amish garden closes as a single circle. Even if the harvest increases, if there is no method to properly preserve it, the abundance ends as something temporary. That is precisely why a highly productive garden is not completed simply by growing a lot. Connecting the blessings of the harvest to the seasons when things do not grow is what is important. For the Amish people, preservation is not something done as an afterthought to garden work. It is not an addition performed when time is left over. Preservation is the latter half of the garden itself, integrated right from the beginning into the flow that continues from the field to the dining table. When boiling tomatoes and filling jars in August, that task is not a whim of just that day. From the moment the seedlings were planted in the spring, a portion of those tomatoes was considered as something to be eaten in the winter. The summer harvest does not exist for the summer alone. It is grown to support the autumn table, to support the winter table, and to support the period in early spring when the cold still remains. I previously thought that being able to harvest a lot was the most important thing. However, while watching the flow of the Amish garden, I came to understand that the harvest is not the destination, but a point along the way. Tomatoes are not only for eating immediately after picking. Green beans are not only for hurriedly sharing with someone when you cannot finish them. Cucumbers do not end simply by rejoicing that a basketful was picked. If the quantity increases, a destination is needed beyond that. Tomatoes can be boiled and preserved. Cucumbers can be made into pickles. Cabbage can be fermented and enjoyed for a long time. Onions can be kept by hanging them in a well-ventilated place. Root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and beets can support the dining table for a long time if placed in a cool, stable location. Thinking this way, it becomes clear that the garden is not only a place to prepare today's meal, but also a place to gradually prepare for the life ahead. This perspective also changes the meaning of the word harvest yield. A good garden is not a garden that produces just exactly the amount that can be eaten every day. A truly good garden is one that produces an abundance that leaves a little extra when needed and can skillfully carry that surplus into the future. Research and practical examples of intensive home gardening also state that a properly managed garden can produce harvests that greatly exceed the amount eaten fresh during the height of summer. At that time, if there is no concept of preservation, that hard-won abundance will spoil and be lost in the blink of an eye. But if there is a plan for preservation, that very surplus transforms into peace of mind for the cold seasons. Amish households think about such things quite specifically. Even when deciding how many tomato plants to plant, it is not just because it seems like they will be able to pick a lot. They think while visualizing how many jars will be necessary during the winter, how many potatoes to plant, is also decided from the perspective of how many months of the dining table they want to support, rather than just to enjoy a single harvest. In this way, the garden ceases to be a place to be tended at will as an extension of a hobby. It becomes an important foundation tied to the family's life itself. Some crops are grown to be eaten right now. Some crops are grown for preservation. Some crops are fermented, some are dried, and some are laid to rest in a cool place. The clearer those roles are, the less waste there is in every single choice within the garden. Reaching this point, it is clearly seen that all the contrivances seen so far are connected as a single flow. Dense planting exists to get more from limited land. Staggered planting exists to lengthen the time the furrows work. Vertical gardening exists to transform even the space above the ground into production. Intercropping exists to draw multiple values from the same location. And preservation exists to carry the results of all of those to the other side of the seasons. Any one of them alone does not constitute the true strength of an Amish garden. Even if only the harvest is large, if you do not preserve it, you lose it. Even if there is wisdom in preservation, if the field does not produce enough, no stores will be born. Therefore, this garden consists not as a collection of small techniques, but as a system of mutual support. And the biggest lesson there might be that they are arranging life itself through the garden. Not wasting the land, not wasting the seasons, not wasting the harvest. That accumulation ultimately leads to the family's peace of mind. From the outside, all that might be there are vegetable furrows, wooden stakes, and preserved foods lined up on shelves. However, behind that, a very quiet and certain way of thinking flows, making full use of what exists now, not letting the abundance before one's eyes end as a one-time event. That stance is what transforms a small garden into a place that supports the family. Therefore, what can be learned from an Amish garden is not merely how to harvest a lot. What can be learned from there is the sense of how to make life more settled within a limited space and time. A garden is a seasonal pleasure, but simultaneously, it can also be a foundation that quietly supports daily life. When you realize that the eyes with which you look at the garden will surely change, it becomes not just a place to plant vegetables, but a place to gradually accumulate abundance for the family. And I believe that change itself is the true power of this small garden.